All right, Yvonne, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to our 22nd Transatlantic AI Exchange session. Today is November 29th, 2022. TAIEX is a community of experts who are passionate about collaborating and sharing knowledge about innovation technologies, especially around artificial intelligence. Collectively, we are creating and empowering an ecosystem to make meaningful connections and conduct business. My name is Thomas Neubert, born and raised in Germany, a longtime entrepreneur living in Silicon Valley for over 31 years now, and now working at Intel's headquarters in Santa Clara around topics related to artificial intelligence and the data center of the future. Allow me to provide a quick overview of this Transatlantic AI Exchange initiative. First, let's share the slides, please. First, we want to thank all our partners who are helping us build this valuable network. For today's session, a special thanks goes to the KI Bundesverband and TAM Consulting, specifically reaching out to their SMB Mittelstand customer and member base. At TAIEX, we foster exchanges on AI, targeting entrepreneurs and researchers, investors, corporations, the SMB Mittelstand, and governments, building long-term partnerships, and focus on hands-on expertise like fundraising, customer engagements, go-to-market execution, and SMB Mittelstand understanding the implementation of AI. On the next slide, you will see all videos, including today's sessions, are accessible for free, available on our website under the events section. So please share with your colleagues and watch it again using AI tools for easier searching of content. Yvonne, would you mind sharing the slides? Switching it, please. We are excited to also announce our 2022 awards program to support entrepreneurs in their journey. Any person who attended at least 2 of our 2022 TAIEX events, shared our events, and follow us on LinkedIn can win up to $1,000 towards travel expenses and up to 6 hours of coaching, mentoring from TAIEX experts. If you all believe our event is of value to you and your network, we greatly appreciate you share and like us on our LinkedIn page. A LinkedIn page will be just added to the chat box so you know how to find it. We are excited today to announce yet another experienced panel of 2 experts, Greg and David, to discuss topics around demystifying artificial intelligence. So let's get to it. Misperception about artificial intelligence to start with. Most people associate AI with a picture created by Hollywood movies about robots taking over humankind and the perception that AI will eliminate most jobs as known today. Well, let's listen today to 2 leading experts who have some of the best easy to understand material created around the topic that I have seen in the last 2 years. If data is the new oil, artificial intelligence is the tool to utilize it. AI is a horizontal workload, not a vertical application or segment. AI is the ability to perceive or infer information and to retain it as knowledge to be applied towards adaptive behaviors. A quick comment about the difference between AI, machine learning, and deep learning. Sometimes it's very confusing. AI can be found in healthcare, manufacturing, logistics, video surveillance, fraud detection, and many, many more market segments and use cases. AI applications include advanced web search engines like Google, recommendation systems used by YouTube, Amazon, Netflix, and understanding human speech, such as Siri and Alexa. So as you believe it or not, we all are using AI already on a daily basis. Self-driving cars like Tesla, automated decision-making and competing at the highest level in strategic games, systems like chess or the game Go. Now, machine learning, or in short ML, is a fundamental concept of AI research since the field's inception. It's the study of computing algorithms and statistical methods that improve automatically through experiences. Deep learning, however, is a subset of machine learning, in which multi-layered neural networks learn from vast amounts of data. Over the last few months, I had the pleasure to have joint presentations with two very special individuals, and we are honored today to listen to their presentations. I can assure you, you all will take something away from this, and I bet you want to hear more afterwards. With that, I would like to introduce today's speakers. First up will be Greg LeBlanc. He's a distinguished teaching fellow at University of California, Berkeley, Haas School of Business, and a lecturer at Stanford University Graduate School of Business, and he is a host at Unsiloed Podcast. David Carmona is the General Manager, Artificial Intelligence and Innovation at Microsoft, and the Arthur O'Reilly's The AI Organization. Besides working at Microsoft for literally 21 years, David also launched a series of AI one-on-one whiteboard sessions. Each episode will have two videos, one focused on the technology, AI Development 101, and one is focused on the business, AI in Business one-on-one. And if time permits, by the end of this session, we should be able to answer a few questions from the audience at the end. So on that note, I would like to ask Greg, welcome, and please provide your knowledge, insights, and the presentation. Please take it from here, Greg. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Thomas. Appreciate it. So I'm going to try and work through very quickly in 20 minutes, a short summary of the kinds of things that I actually do over many hours and many weeks with business executives and MBA students. And the main thrust of my presentation is to make the point that while Thomas mentioned things like Google and Facebook and YouTube and TikTok and so forth and Tesla, you don't need to be one of these massive companies in order to start implementing AI almost immediately in pretty much every aspect of your business, right? It's something that is now accessible to people at a very, very basic level. If you're a small school, you're in the Mittelstand, even if you're a small business, SMB, you can start using AI because it's available as a service through various tools, and no-code, low-code solutions are now beginning to spread quite rapidly. So you don't need to have a background in Python or R or higher, like super sophisticated PhDs in computer science and so forth. It's something you can do in the same way that Excel is now being used by pretty much everybody. So too will machine learning be able to be used by everybody. So just a bit about myself here. I always start with this example. Billy Beane. This guy was the manager of a baseball team, a sports team not too far from where I live, and I've met him a bunch of times. And he was the inspiration behind this movie and this book, which you may have seen, called Moneyball. Now, the reason why I mention this guy is because, he had no college education whatsoever, right? He was an athlete. And yet, when he managed this organization, he fundamentally transformed it from one that was organized and managed primarily by intuition and gut into an organization that was managed almost entirely with data, science, and evidence. And this transformation was one that happened, nearly 20 years ago. And since then, people have looked to his example and said, well, if he can do that for a relatively small enterprise, I can do that for my relatively small enterprise. And of course, it's not something that you do overnight. It's not something that you do for every aspect of your business. You got to start somewhere. And where he started was in recruiting and hiring and retaining employees. He started with HR. Okay, so if you remember from the movie, right, the traditional HR experts, the recruiters, right, the interviewers, were these old men who had a lot of experience and history in the business, probably like your HR department. And they would look at a candidate and say, well, this candidate looks like a good player because they remind me of some other player that was good. Okay. Now, this is pattern recognition. It's done by the carbon-based processor that sits in your head. And, as humans, we're pretty dang good at this, right, in the grand scheme of things. But when the number of instances and the amount of data we have to process gets bigger and bigger, and the number of features we have to deal with gets bigger and bigger, the more difficult it is for us to rely on this carbon-based processor. And, the more comparative advantage we get from starting to use something like silicon, okay? So there's a great example of, in this movie where, they're looking at some candidate and they're like, well, this guy has an ugly girlfriend, so he's not going to be a good player. I love this scene because it's such a bizarre example. But it's not clear whether their hypothesis is a good one or bad one because there's no data to support either the yes or the no. And so they fall back on their gut and their intuition. Now, by just simply shifting towards a more data-centric hiring practice, what this baseball team was able to do was to compete against the best teams with about a third of their payroll. It would be as if, I don't know, some team from, Freiburg, right, could compete against Bayern München, right, in the German league. Highly unlikely. But if you have a competitive advantage by using analytics, then you can start playing well beyond what you would normally be able to do. So I call this HR alpha. And I like to argue that if you, do this in HR, then you can start doing it, for sales. And usually it's actually marketing that is way ahead of any other part of your organization. They're the ones that are most familiar with data. Maybe in Germany, it's supply chain and manufacturing and operations. Okay, but it doesn't really matter where you start. Once you start to see the benefit of using data and analytics, you can start moving it into other domains. And so that's why we talk about kind of the money ball of everything. Now, just to de-intimidate this a little bit, demystify it a bit, what we're talking about here is not deep learning, okay? It's not sophisticated TensorFlow or anything like this. This is just like spreadsheets, okay? Organizing your data in a structured way using rows and columns, the way you do in Excel. And so if you've ever run a linear regression in Excel, you have done data science, believe it or not, where you have rows which constitute individuals and you have columns which represent features. And all you're trying to do is classify, right? So classification is the main exercise in data science. Just classify candidates into, good employees, bad employees, good borrowers, bad borrowers, good targets for ads, bad targets for ads. And what you're doing is you're looking at new instances, comparing them to your library of historical data and doing pattern recognition to figure out whether this new candidate is more like a good employee or more like a bad employee, or in the case of this example right here, more like a good borrower or more like a bad borrower. And so all you're doing really is what we call training and scoring. And even when we move to the most complex deep learning models, that's really all we're doing. We're just doing it with more bells and whistles. It's called training and scoring. You start with a model, in a simple version, like a logistic regression model. You feed it data, and as you feed it data, it starts to take on some form. And the more data you feed it, the better the quality of the model, the algorithm. And then you create a scoring model for new instances. Okay, so training and scoring, that's all it is. Filling out the table and then adding a new row and then predicting the value of a cell, which is, the variable of interest. So if it's only two variables, and usually it's way more than that, then you're just trying to divide like a line right? Create a line or some barrier, some boundary in your training data between the good instances and the bad instances. You're trying to come up with a prediction boundary, which then, you convert into a decision boundary. And at the end of the day, you have to start with what is the problem you're trying to solve? What is the decision you're trying to make? And then that's going to guide the entire model creation. Okay. And then you're going to do a bit of trial and error, and you're going to compare like a decision tree with a logistic regression, figure out which one works, do some out of sample testing, and you're good to go. Okay. And at the end of the day, what you're going to wind up with is something like this. This is what we call a profit curve. And this is something that, a data scientist actually is not going to do this as well as you can do it if you have a bit of business background and a bit of domain expertise. So I think that some organizations have veered too far in the data science direction and forgotten that ultimately what we're doing here is solving business problems. So if you can understand this slide, then you will understand data science in a nutshell. Okay. So what do we have here? What we have here is an example of a company that's trying to figure out, right, whether or not to launch an ad campaign. All right. And so they have in the upper right-hand corner here, you have what we call a cost benefit matrix. And this cost benefit matrix tells you how much it's worth, right? How much is it worth to have a successful, ad? And it says that if you have a successful ad, which we call a true positive, the model says advertise to this person, you advertise to the person, they convert, you get a $4 profit. And if you have a false positive, meaning your model says advertise to this person, they turn out not to be a converter, it's going to cost you $5. Okay. So this is something that, as the business person, you're intimately familiar with. Okay. So if you understand the costs and benefits of your advertising, then you can compute, right, what your break-even probability is for this campaign. So before you launch a campaign, right, you're going to need to justify the campaign. So just imagine this following scenario. You've got somebody in the business who's like, hey, I think we should launch this campaign. And you, because you're more senior and more experienced, you say, well, before we launch this campaign, why don't we run a pilot? Okay, so this is the experimental mindset. Let's run a pilot and see if this campaign is worth it. It needs to have, let's say, a 55% conversion rate in order to justify the spend. Okay, so then the person runs the small pilot, gets and randomizes all that kind of stuff, runs a really nice A/B test, comes back and says, turns out only 45% of the people responded to the ad. And so, you're experimental, you're doing A/B testing, you're not relying on your gut, you're relying on the data. And so you're going to say, well, then let's not launch it. Okay. Now, so far you think you're being data driven. So far you think you're doing a great job. You've run an experiment, you've done an A/B test, you've done a pilot, except that you just made the wrong mistake. You made a mistake. Because the real answer here is, it depends. Yeah, I got a 45% response rate, but that's because I randomized. But if I have just gathered up all this data from my pilot and I look a little deeper and I have characteristics about the people that I advertise to, then I can actually predict whether an individual is likely to respond and assign some probability to it. So in other words, there may be some people who have characteristics which suggests they have a 90% probability of responding, and others with a 0% probability of responding. So if I can rank order my targets from most likely to respond to least likely to respond and segment them so that I can say, all right, if you have a probability of responding greater than 55%, I will target you. And if it's lower than that, I won't target you. Then I can generate some profit. Okay, so what this visual is telling you is, if I were to just simply advertise randomly to people, the more ads I run, the more money I lose. That's this downward sloping line. But if I sort them and rank them and score them, right, from best to worst, and I start advertising to the low-hanging fruit and work my way up the tree, I can actually squeeze a lot of profit out of this ad campaign Okay. As long as I stop here, okay, and advertise only to that subset of people that have a higher probability of conversion than the break even. So this is about, doing granularity. Now, I had an interview with John List, who was the chief economist at Uber and Lyft and Walmart. And he said, this is the single biggest mistake that most business people make, which is that they fail to understand the granularity of their decisions. They fail to understand the principle of deciding on the margin. Okay. They make either or decisions, either launch the campaign or don't launch the campaign, when the reality says, launch a partial campaign, segment the campaign, right? And the only way to find out how to do this is to, right, go and collect some data and then analyze the data. Okay, go and collect the data and then analyze the data. Okay? And so, what we're talking about here is data science, and data science, overlaps with machine learning and artificial intelligence. Okay. What we just did is an example of machine learning, but it's guided by, business leaders who understand what the question is and they understand appropriate methodology for sampling. And then they unleash some of this data science. But again, it's the kind of data science that you can learn in just a few minutes. It's not the kind that requires the hiring of a PhD and so forth. Okay, I'll give you one more example. Here's a bank called Signet Bank. Talk about SMBs. This is one of the smallest banks in the United States, based out of Maryland. Okay, they became the largest credit card issuer in the world. How did they do it? Well, they did exactly what I just described. They looked around and they thought there was an untapped opportunity with all of these folks in the US that didn't have credit cards. And they didn't have credit cards because the conventional wisdom was that they had, bad credit scores. They realized that within this huge pile of people who were excluded from the credit market, there might be some people who are actually good customers. Now, the only way to figure out who they are is to collect data and analyze it. So what they did is they sent out a whole bunch of credit cards to people at random. They used a random sample. They sent a whole bunch of credit cards to these people who had bad credit. And then they waited. And what happened was that most of these people defaulted, but a small subset did not. And they were able to identify the predictive characteristics of those people who, defaulted and the ones who didn't. And so after about a year, and all this time, of course, they were losing money. All this time, they were bleeding money, right? Loan losses and so forth. But finally, after the end of the year, they cut off all the credit cards of the people who defaulted. And what were they left with? They were left with this tiny little pile of profitable users. But more important than that, they now had enough data that they could use to generate a predictive analytics model, and then they could go out and send credit applications to all the people in the United States who matched those characteristics. Okay, now look, to a typical business person, they would look at this experiment and say, "Oh my gosh, that's a loss. We lost money that year." But to a more savvy business person, you'd look at that and you'd say, "That's R&D. We just spent money acquiring training data, which we can use to achieve some wisdom, which will help us going forward for the next couple decades." Okay? Okay. I'll give you one last example. And because we just have a few minutes left, I'll give you one last example. And this is from a company that I helped to a bunch of my friends to create a couple of years back. And this was in the HR space. And a very, very simple model, right? And very small. It's just two people started companies with call centers. And the call centers have super high turnover rates. And when you interview all the heads of these call centers, they all had all sorts of theories about, why people were quitting and, who was a good employee. And they had all sorts of, conventional wisdom and rumors and so forth. And this is how they guided their hiring policies. Well, it turns out that most of them were completely wrong. And the way we figured this out was we collected a whole bunch of data from a bunch of companies, just went and got their HR data, looked at their HR data. And remember, this HR data was not collected for the purpose of recruiting and hiring. It was just like compliance data. But anyway, we took all this data, we looked at it, we analyzed it, and figured out, right, what types of people make good employees for call centers and what type of people make bad employees. And it was nothing like what the people in HR thought. They thought that education mattered, prior experience mattered, right? They thought, general intelligence. They thought all these things mattered, but it turned out that the things that mattered were things that people hadn't even thought of. In fact, there was one characteristic which was super, super predictive, and that was what browser they used to apply for the job. You're thinking, what? How could that possibly be predictive? And what could possibly explain this? Now, it turns out we don't know. We have no idea why this seemed to work. All we know is that it worked. If you hired people who used Firefox or Chrome, they were more productive, they stayed on the job longer, they had higher productivity, better customer satisfaction than the folks who used Internet Explorer. Which meant that before the people had even answered any of the interview questions online, we already knew if they were going to be good or bad. Okay? This is the kind of thing that you can get when you start collecting data, feeding it into a model, and training a model. Okay? And of course, it's being used in banking. It's being used in all sorts of other things like recommendation engines we don't have time to talk about. So I'll just simply fast forward to say this. Why do gigantic companies and small companies made of insanely intelligent people make bad decisions? Because they rely on persuasion and PowerPoint, not on experimentation. Now, if you think you need a PhD to do this, you don't. It wasn't that long ago where you needed to use, you had to know Python, you had to know, Stata, you had to know all this stuff. Now you don't need to do it. There's stuff that you can grab off the shelf. Right. And so the process now is much, much simpler. Now you'll hear about, Microsoft and Google and Amazon. They have some wonderful products and so forth. But there's even simpler products out there. This is just a couple. Some of my favorites include, BigML, Data Robot, Able. These are tools which I use in my classroom to teach, MBAs, some of whom have very limited, quantitative skills. And so you should do this exercise for your business. And I'll end with this, but do this exercise for your business. Try to figure out where you are on this kind of scale of sophistication, AI sophistication, data science sophistication. The very first thing you need is good quality data. That's what we call descriptive analytics. Do you have data? If you don't have data, well, you're in trouble. Get some data. Then figure out, can you read this data to figure out what the heck happened? Why did it happen? That's what we call diagnostic analytics. The next stage is to do what we've been talking about, predictive analytics. What will happen if I hire this person? What will happen if I lend money to this person? What will happen if I, run this ad campaign? And then finally, what we have is prescriptive analytics. And this is when you can start automating things, start automating the advertising decision-making, the hiring decision-making, and so forth. And as you go through these steps of sophistication, what you're doing is you're squeezing out the grunt work. You're squeezing out the tedious work. You're squeezing out the carbon-based processing. And so I always recommend that when you go on this journey, start with the simplest stuff, like linear regression, decision trees, and so forth, and then work your way up to TensorFlow and all the other more complicated things. But start with the easy stuff that's easy to understand and easy to explain, because oftentimes just data scientists and PhDs will not be able to explain what they're doing. And then, you might wind up making some silly mistakes. So you've heard that software is eating the world, is the Mark Andreessen famous quote. I say data is eating the world. So thank you so much. And feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. We can talk about this some more. Thomas, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Greg. As always, I love listening to your presentation and the content. I know you have much, much more. Before I give it over to David, maybe a quick question, and that is, imagine you are the founder of a mid-sized company, like a family-owned company, whatever. You have 1,000 employees, maybe 2,000, maybe just a few hundred, and you are the CEO of that company, and you do not have the expertise like the Google has, or an Intel or a Microsoft. As a CEO, where would you start this journey to get your company moving into the direction of these examples that you just had? In regards to the tools, external consultants, how would you start this process? What advice do you give?
Well, I'd say, what are your key business problems, key business challenges? Is it customer acquisition? Is it recruiting and hiring? Is it, what are the processes that you find yourself doing over and over again? And once you start there, like, what are your pain points? Then you just start tackling them and say, okay, am I collecting data on what I'm doing? And if you're not collecting data on what you're doing, let's just start collecting it. If you record customer identification, if you record like your sales data, if you record your purchasing data, if you just start collecting that data, then once you have that data, you can just jump in and start looking at the data and using these simple tools like, drag and drop into big ML and just, ask a question, say, hey, which customers are buying my products, which employees are doing well. And then that's where you start. And then once you start extracting some insight from those super, super simple questions, then you're off to the races.
Okay. And so one of my takeaways was here, most companies actually already have data of some sort. They're sitting on a massive amount of mostly unstructured data, but they need to start with defining the problem they're trying to solve, looking at the data that they have available, and then build up more stack. And then only then apply the process of AI, machine learning, what have you.
Yeah. So in that HR example I mentioned, we started with this organic HR data that was just sitting in like PeopleSoft and started analyzing that. And then we realized, oh, well, wouldn't it be better if we had better quality data? And then you start asking like more complicated interview questions and collecting more richer data, because the data that you have may not be data that is optimal for the decision making. But you got to start somewhere. So start with the data you have, and then you'll say, man, wouldn't it be great if we could have better data? And then you start going collecting better data.
Okay. And then maybe to the next step, if they have gotten through all these steps, the initial steps, but they don't have the internal know-how in regards to the researchers, the developers, the whatever, are there already established consulting services to help you with cleaning up the data and building some models and things like that? Or are there some specific resources we can point the audience to?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are external consultants. Usually the external consultants are for the larger companies. I mean, for the smaller companies, I think that you just have to, when you're recruiting and hiring people, you've got to like recruit and hire people that have a little bit more awareness of how to use data, right? And when we interview people, we typically interview them because they we like them and they're personable, and they might come in with some domain expertise. Tilt the balance a little bit away from the domain expertise and towards a little bit of understanding of how to manipulate data. That is also another place I'd start.
Got it. Okay. So thank you very much again, as always. Love listening to your stories. And with that, I would like to hand it over to David from Microsoft, who has some additional interesting insights on how to apply AI into organizations. David, take it from here. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And Greg, thank you so much for that first part. I think you always present in a way that is so clear. I think the second part, it goes a little bit on, okay, so given that you are in that journey or embracing AI in your organization, how you can make that at scale? How do you turn that corner of moving from what I used to call the pilot purgatory into AI that can have relevant business impact, right? And in a sense, I kind of start by the way that you ended, Greg, is the fact that every company is a software company. That has been like the motto for many years, right? So we in the technology industry, we had the fortune of experiencing that transformation, that it wasn't just for technology companies. It was actually every company in the planet had to transform to turn into a software company. As we look at AI transforming software, at the end of the day, what we're going to see is how every company will need now to turn into an AI company. So that's just following the easiest definition of AI, which is just a new way of creating software. So we can think of AI in many fancy ways, but at the end of the day, we're creating software in a different way. So we create that software by learning over data instead of manually instructing the computer what to do, right? And that is a new way of creating software, and therefore it's going to have a similar impact that software had. Now, the interesting part here is, what does it mean to be an AI company? That's the question that I would try to cover a little bit today. And it's not a question about technology. Technology is just one of the dimensions. It is a much deeper conversation, just like the software transformation in the industry was way more than a technology conversation. It had to change many different dimensions in a company. And I have 4 here. So those are the 4 that I will touch briefly today. The first one, culture, because at the end of the day, it's a transformation that needs to happen in the entire organization, not just the technical departments. And that brings the need of also addressing a cultural change in the organization. The second one is strategy. How do I create a strategy? So the question that you were asking, Thomas, on, hey, where do I even start? So yes, one thing is starting, but then how do I move forward? So what are the steps on that strategy? How do I create a comprehensive strategy that brings not only the short term, but that connects that to the long term? Then yes, of course, technology is part of this equation. And then the last one, which is quite unique in the case of AI, which is responsibility. AI comes with also additional challenges that we need to consider from the get-go. It can't be an afterthought for AI. So we'll cover that briefly today. So let me start with culture. So culture, I would synthesize into just one concept, right? So when you think about the AI transformation in any company, we usually start with the technical departments. We usually start by creating an AI center of excellence, or we have a department very focused on the technical revolution of AI, but we forget the transformation that needs to happen across the entire company. So something that I always said is that, hey, instead of thinking of AI departments, think more of AI companies. So how are you transforming your entire company into an AI-centric company? Because if you just focus on the transformation of the technical departments, that is not going to be enough. So we've seen many cases, even internally in Microsoft, we also went through this challenge, right? Where it is critical that you bring the business from the get-go if you want to be successful with AI. And Greg, you mentioned that when you were answering also Thomas' question on where do I start, right? Start with the business. That's an important thing to do, right? So you need the both angles. Actually, when you go deeper, what I try to explain is that it's not one or the other. It's both of them. So you need to have to create a comprehensive strategy. You need to have the conjunction, the union of business and technology. And you want to do that in a continuous cycle. So you want the business and technology to be all the time connected throughout the continuous journey of AI transformation. And they will both have different roles. So in the case of the business, it will be more a view of from business to technology. So there are many frameworks out there to kind of empower that conversation from business to technology. I like particularly one, that's the one that we use in Microsoft. When we're separating our conversations with customers, we separate it in 4 big dimensions, right? So we talk about customers, how AI can help you transform the way that you, for example, interact with customers. We talk about employees, so how can you improve, for example, the productivity of employees. We talk about processes, how you can optimize processes in your organization. And we talk about products, how you can create new products for your company. Then on top of that, you can also layer like 3 different angles, right? So one is you can always look at each of these 4 from the optimization point of view. That's usually the first step, right? Some of the examples Greg was mentioning were in that front, right? So how can we optimize the way that we do customer interactions, employee productivity processes or products in a way that can maximize my revenue or minimize my cost, whatever. But there's 2 more that are equally, if not more important. The second one is, can I disrupt my industry? Can I disrupt my business? Can I find new business models for my organization that are now possible because of AI? That's a super interesting one. And then the third one that unfortunately in the last 3 years became more and more important is, can I use this AI technology to become more resilient against this external disruption that we are experiencing, right? Either a pandemic crisis or now more recently, even an economic crisis, right? So these are the angles that we usually use for that business to technology conversation. But if you stay there, usually you are going to stay just on the surface, right? The reality is that AI is a technology that is just starting, right? So you need to understand what are the capabilities of AI. You need to understand what is the flow or what is the journey or roadmap of that AI to make this aspiration realistic to implement, right? So therefore, it is super important that you also have another conversation, which is from technology to business. And here's where you talk more about the capabilities of AI. And this, of course, you have, again, thousands of frameworks that you can use. Usually, I like to use one that separates this in two. One is the modality. So you have vision, speech, language, graphs, tabular data, like your data from your existing structure systems, or knowledge in your company, whatever you have in your company for data. But then the second layer on top of that is what is the task, right? And the task can be predicting, can be classifying, optimizing, planning, recommending, generating some of these modalities. So with that technology, that continuous conversation between business and technology, you are going to end, hopefully, with many potential use cases, right? So the idea here, the more the better, right? So you want to have as many cases or have as many examples. Some of them will be short term, some of them will be more long term, but at the end of the day, you want to cover as much as you can, right? But then once you have that, you need to map it, right? This is a framework that we use in Microsoft as well, and it's very simple. So, I mean, the idea here is just to have like an inventory of your potential investments on use cases for a particular, in this case, technology like AI. And what we do with that is, yes, well, let's put everything in here. So two axes, as you can see. One is the potential impact. So even if I put the dollar sign, it can be anything. It can be cost or revenue, but it can be customer satisfaction, whatever the outcome you want. And then on the axis, you have the time or the investment needed for that particular use case. So at the end of the day, with that, you're going to have like this map. And then what we do with this map is we classify these investments in horizons. And there are 3 horizons that we manage. This is based on a McKinsey framework, the Horizon framework, where you basically like classify your investments in Horizon 1, long-term focus on existing products. Horizon 2, new products or new capabilities that you can add to create these new products in the middle or midterm, or Horizon 3, which is long-term big investments on even new business models for your company. Now, once you do that, the important thing here, because this is nice, I have a classification, you can start having discussions, for example, on the balance, right? So you don't want to have everything in Horizon 1. You want to have a balanced approach in here where you have some investments in Horizon 1, but at the same time, you're also pointing at a North Star in Horizon 3. So the important thing here is really connecting these dots, right? It's making sure that whatever I'm doing now in Horizon 1 is connected to a broader, more ambitious vision that I have for the long term. Because if you have these connected dots in here, what that is telling you is that there's no path for a longer vision that you can do over time, right? And the same can also work the other way around. So you see a disconnected dot in Horizon 3, those are very challenging, right? Because it's very difficult to execute on those big visions if they can't show value today. So I bet that besides huge corporations, it's very challenging for you to drive like moonshots, like autonomous driving, right? For your company. Those are very difficult if you don't get like middle points where you can show value to the business today. So that's the strategy, right? The third thing is technology. And technology, I just want to bring an interesting concept that we're going to see more and more in technology. So there are 2 models for AI that I think is important that we start recognizing them, because this is going to transform dramatically the way that we approach AI in the future. So there's the traditional AI, which of course is the one that we're not used to. You have a particular task that you want to perform with AI in a particular domain. So you start with a data set for that particular task and domain, you create a model, you train that model on that data set, and that model is able to achieve that task in that domain. Now you want another task or another domain, and you need to start that process from scratch, right? So you start, you need to create or get a data set for that task and domain. You need to train the model for that, and that model will only be useful for that particular task and domain. We're seeing in particular with these massive models that we're starting to see in the market, where we can change that approach to AI. So we can, and there are different ways of calling this model. You may hear about them as foundational models or massive models or large models, whatever. At the end of the day, these are models of many billions of parameters that you train once on a much bigger data set, right? So the data set is usually, in this case of models, for example, language models are trained on the entire corpora from the internet, right? Even the archive of internet, same thing for images, etc. But the interesting part in here is that those models are starting to show multitask, multi-domain, and even multi-modality capabilities. So then the next time that you want to create a model for a particular target task or domain, you just need to customize that model with expertise transfer, which is much easier than training the model from scratch. So that allows you to create AI at scale, right? So this is a significant change of paradigm that will have a lot of implications in the way that we embrace AI. Because at the end of the day, what we're going to see is that, again, instead of having AI as an isolated department where people are just going there to ask for new models, instead of that, what you have is an AI team which is empowering the business units to do that AI transformation. And that is a radically different approach to AI that will enable us to scale AI at the way that we're used to, for example, in traditional software, where we have business units empowered to do things like software-centric business transformations by themselves with the support of a software development team and not the other way around. The critical also a concept in here is going to be MLOps. So if you are not embracing MLOps, it's absolutely critical to scale AI, right? So just like DevOps was the key for us to scale software development in the organizations, MLOps will allow us to do the same for AI and having a continuous cycle between business and technology where we can continuously generate value to the business. So that was the technology transformation. Let me finish with one, which I think is the most important one, the responsible AI transformation, also very critical, right? And we've been many years, I think, at this point, talking about the core challenges that come with AI that we need to be aware of. And yes, that is a great starting point, right? So understanding what are those challenges and having principles, which are basically like rules for your company, for your organization to address those challenges are like, it's the first step. That's the first thing that you need to do, right? But you can't stop there. So you can't just say, hey, I'm going to address, for example, challenges like privacy or bias or transparency on my AI development. You need to turn those principles into practices that you can implement. So the responsible AI is something that cannot be an afterthought. So you need to develop in a way that is aligned with those principles if you want to end aligned with those principles when you deliver that AI model, right? And even when you maintain that AI model. And then there's a third part, which is the tool. So I know that there's a lot of headlines and a lot of wow and shiny objects on AI, but we don't spend enough time on the technology side for responsible AI. We just focus on the shiny new object. And I think it's equally important for us as an industry to focus on the technology that is enabling that responsible AI. So with that, just a quick summary of what I wanted to bring today. So there are three things that I would tell you to do as you are scaling AI in an organization. I would say just these three things. The first one is approach it as a platform. So don't think of AI as a centralized function where everybody's going to, and you are just a black box where you are delivering, for example, AI solutions. Instead of that, think more of providing a platform for the rest of the organization to use, so it is connected to the business. The second one is that will only work if you also address the cultural change in the entire company. So you need to have the business units and even the employees to be encouraged to participate on that AI transformation in your company. So that is a critical one, that without that one, AI is not going to have a big impact in the business. And then the last one is, don't think of responsible AI as something that I will worry about that later. That doesn't work. So you need to infuse responsible AI in every phase of your AI transformation, not just at the end of it. Thomas, that was all that I had. I will put my LinkedIn link as well. So if there's any question, I can stay 10 more minutes until the end of the hour, and then happy to answer any question also on LinkedIn.
This is great. Thank you very much, David. And maybe if Greg is still on, if he wants to turn his video on. I haven't. So first of all, thank you both very much. I know you just scrapped the tip of the iceberg. You have so much more content to share. Maybe just a direct question to Greg, because of the content that he's teaching at California and at Berkeley has. Is there any of these contents that you also teach in virtual classes, so people can actually sign up for these classes remotely? Is that a possibility?
At the moment, I'm not offering any distance learning classes to non-students at Berkeley and Stanford. I think there's definitely a demand, definitely an interest. So, and the thing is, it's super teachable, right? Like I said, you don't need to learn how to code. You just need to learn how to, think through these problems. And people with a good business background actually are important additions to any data science team. Right. And they oftentimes they underestimate their contribution, and they defer unnecessarily to, data science experts.
Okay. Maybe just another question, maybe a quick comment. What is your podcast all about?
It covers a lot of different ground. If you're particularly interested in AI topics, I've got a couple podcasts where I interview authors of books on AI. There's one that I just put into the chat, book by AJ Agarwal and Josh Gans called Prediction Machines. I interviewed AJ. There's a couple others like Stuart Russell here at Berkeley that I interview, and Brian Christian, who's also an author. So if you go to the website, if you go to the Unsiloed Podcast website and filter under AI or data, Tom Davenport's on there, a bunch of others, that you'll find a bunch of interviews that touch on these topics.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, I do that a lot, by the way. When I walk or something, I listen to podcasts. Maybe a little bit geeky. It's mostly AI, but it's just, I love the topic. And for some of the audience maybe here, if we look back in the late 90s with the invention of the Mosaic browser, the web browser initially, and then the public going IPO of Netscape, which was kind of the birth of the internet. I would say today with AI, we are today with AI where we were roughly in 1997, 98 with the internet. So this is still early, this is still developing, so nobody has, lost the boat yet. It's still early enough to jump in it and stay competitive with your own company going forward. Maybe, David, to you also the opportunity. Can elaborate quickly what you have with what I said earlier, this one-on-one classes that you are giving, because I would like to give people the opportunity in their own leisure, in their own time, to get educated more as they have the time to do it. And I have not looked at your episodes yet, but can you maybe quickly comment on that one as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So happy to point to it. The easiest way is in the link that I put in the chat window in my LinkedIn. There's a post in there that is highlighted with the list of sessions. It's a fun experiment that I did on a funny, more entertaining way of going through this sometimes boring concepts, right? So when you're talking about AI applied to the business, it can be very challenging and quite boring, to be honest. So I try to do some whiteboarding to make it a little bit more enjoyable. So happy to take any feedback or any recommendations for the future. That is my kind of side personal thing that I try to do as much as I can, usually over the weekends, but happy to take any feedback. The other thing that I would mention which is quite successful, coming in this case from Microsoft, is the AI Business School. So completely free, available for free. I can put the URL in a second in the chat window, but it goes through actually very similar for pillars that I was covering today. So strategy, culture, responsibility, technology, in way more detail. And one of the things that we try to do in that, and I'm also answering to that question from John on when did Microsoft switch to an AI company, where we're still in that process, right? So that is a never-ending process, I have to say. But if you want to learn that journey in Microsoft, we actually have many people from Microsoft sharing also from the business side, how was that transformation, right? And we have people from Brad, our president, to Amy, our CFO, and many other leaders in Microsoft sharing the good, the bad, and the ugly. So it's not only the fantastic stories that you can see in every case study, right? So you only get like the beautified version of it. We also share the learnings that we have through this process. And answering to your question, John, I think that one of the things that in my personal experience, I identified as a critical moment on becoming more like AI company is when we realized that centralizing all the AI development in Microsoft was not going to work, right? So we have, for example, the case of the finance department, which the implementation of a top-down approach, where it was basically the leaders just trying to identify cases, setting the strategy, and then working with technology to bring in there all the beauties and all the amazing models to the finance world. That wasn't working, right? Because not only you didn't have the business connected to it, you even have rejection from the team, right? Because it was something that, and at that time, AI was looked like even a challenge for and a threat for employees, right? So you had like the opposite reaction from them. So at that moment, for that particular case, we completely changed that approach, and we started with a training for all the employees in the finance department, no matter what their role was, on the basis of AI. And then we started bottom up instead of top down, for the employees in that department to be involved in, hey, what are the problems from the business side that you want to apply AI to, now that you understand the basis of the capabilities of AI? And that was dramatically better. And for example, finance is one of the departments in Microsoft that was like the early adopters and more successful after a while with the AI transformation.
I can second what you just said about Microsoft applying it to Intel. The whole AI does not happen. The transformation does not happen overnight. It's a journey, probably a never-ending journey. It has to come from the top down with some basic directions, and then it needs to be implemented over time. So for everybody in the audience here, who is a mid-sized company, a small-sized company, or even a startup, don't shy away from diving into this very fast and very deep, because I really believe you have to. Nobody can ignore the fact that AI will affect your individual business, no matter which one it is. You could be running a pizza store versus Microsoft or Intel, or a university. It will affect everybody's supply chain, manufacturing, logistics, pretty much everything. So look into it. Today was just kind of the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, to give you a little bit of a kickstart and break some barriers. But in general, I would encourage, and thank you very much, David and Greg, for sharing some of the resources in the chat. So I will make sure with Yvonne that we will also make it more public, these resources, so people know where to look for. On that note, Yvonne, is there any other question that we should address, or did we address most of them? I did not pay attention.
You already addressed most of them. One question that came up was, what do you think the role of linguistics and linguists will play in the market?
Who wants to give it a shot? We have 1 minute left.
Wow, that in 1 minute is a challenge, but Greg, I'm happy to take, but happy for you to take if you want to.
Well, I mean, look, NLP is a big part of AI right now. So, it's understanding language is important. And And so it's not just always numbers, and in particular, when it comes to understanding speech in social media, right, and chats and, customer reviews and so forth. So, I know I know of someone who has a startup in Seattle that interprets the words in recruitment postings to try and figure out if they're biased, right? To see if they're more likely to recruit women or men or engineers or whatever. And her company has been extraordinarily successful. And so, she has a PhD in NLP. So NLP is really where AI and linguistics come together.
And just to add on top of that, Greg, and I think also looking at the future, one of the things, so as I was mentioning, those foundational models that we're seeing a lot of activity right now on the research side, language as a foundation is being shown to be extremely effective, right? On being like the foundation not only for language tasks, but even for co-reasoning or knowledge, advanced knowledge tasks, where you can have humans and machines co-reasoning to increase our cognitive abilities.
I mean, we could do a whole session on generative AI because it's just so freaking cool. Like the process would normally take 3 days for somebody to just do a mock-up of an ad. Can take, under 30 seconds. It's phenomenal.
So on that note, we are honored today to have these two experts, Greg and David, here on this call. Thank you very much. I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as we did. I will invite them back and other experts next year, 2023. There's so much more to get deeper into the topics. And with that, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And I wish you all a happy, great day and a happy, great week. And if I don't see any of you, Merry Christmas, Merry holidays going forward. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.